Since time immemorial, indigenous people have lived, traveled, and traded in the Puget Sound region. The Donation Land Act of 1850 to encourage westward expansion allowed American settlers to claim these traditional native lands. The explosion of immigration into the region that followed forced the U.S. government into a fraught treaty-making process with local tribes. The original terms of the Medicine Creek Treaty were inadequate and ultimately unaccepted by tribal leaders, resulting in war. The Indigenous Voices podcast is an extension of the award-winning Puget Sound Treaty War Panel series and Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. The podcast advances tribal voices in the telling of Puget Sound history and shares tribal knowledge and expertise with wider audiences.
Monuments and memorials to the Treaty War can be found throughout Western Washington. Many of these monuments were placed over a century ago and reflect a one-sided and racist view of the conflict. In episodes 11 and 12, we discuss these monuments, how tribal participants experience them, and we ask what a monument that provided an opportunity for reconciliation and learning would look like. This is part 1.
I'm Brandon Reynon. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Acting Director for the Historic Preservation Department for the Puyallup Tribe. I'm also a Puyallup tribal member.
Hello, my name is Warren KingGeorge. I'm an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I descend from the Upper Skagit tribe.
Nettsie Bullchild, Nisqually Indian tribe, Director of Archives and Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribal member, and tribal elder.
Hi, my name is Danny Marshall, and I am the current chair of the Steilacoom Indian tribe. I've been working on issues supporting the cultural knowledge of our people since about 1980, and have a passion for making sure that the expertise of the tribal people is shared in a good way.
We think about memorials and such. The first ones that come to mind are the ones that we have in Pierce County that talk about, the ones that are, talking about us savages attacking these innocent military guys, that were just out there promoting the peace and the tranquility of this land, and savagely attacked, by these natives who were just being nuisances to their plan, right? So the ones that come to mind, obviously, the one out by Bonnie Lake that talks about the soldiers being killed, and there's ones over on the Puyallup River that highlight the fort that was there, that was established on our crossing, on the trail crossing. When I think of memorials and that sort of thing, that's what comes to mind is just there's no real memorials for us. There's no real memorials that talk about our warriors, about our sacrifices that are out there. We're having to work with cities and departments on their projects to get signage just to get our story out there told. Because there's just nothing out there really for our Puyallup people. We have our own, on a reservation where we have recognition of memorials for our members who served in the World Wars and Vietnam Wars, that sort of thing. We're working on getting future memorials that we're doing, but yeah, there just isn't, for Puyallup, there just isn't that much as far as memorials go. I think those memorials need to be changed. Because they portray an inaccurate version of the history. The whites didn't even win the war, for crying out loud, and so, but yet because they were more populous, than they were able to do the memorials and create the narrative that they wanted to have. I don't see a problem with having the memorials near our memorials, just so that people can see the accurate history versus the romanticized history. I think, Muckleshoot's done a great job with getting that started. And their Tree War Memorial is amazing. I love the little calls out all the warriors that were there. I think there's room for that where we can have our side told right next to the memorials that are set up by Pierce County. The history of our area is not an easy one for most people to hear. That's what these memorials got to be doing. They got to be telling the history so that people understand what we went through, but that also shows the perseverance, the strength of our ancestors that has allowed us to be who we are today. And so if we're going to memorialize anything, it has to be done in a manner that accurately portrays what happened and is truthful and is open, and not covered up like what we have with whitewashed memorials that are out there. They cover up so much and it's so romanticized. We need to talk about the truthfulness behind all this if we're going to put memorials up, and recognize those true warriors who fought for, recognize what they gave up, and recognize what they went through and how they represented their people and what they sacrificed to become the leaders and the warriors that we know them today. When it comes to visiting like Leshai's memorial, even if it's at Cushman Cemetery, or when I visited down there at that mall area down there towards Nisqually's area, those memorials, there's a respect, there's a somber emotion that comes, like you recognize what happened here in this spot, or at least near this spot. An innocent man who, was hung for doing what any white man has been doing, and it was a battle scene. He was fighting for his people. You recognize what Leshai did, so you have that reverence. Now, when I go visit or drive by even these other memorials, it's like give them the bird, give them the finger, F you on your version of history. Really it's an anger. It's an aggression that comes out of just like, that's a lie, and that's not the truth. So yeah, there's definitely, it's strong negative emotions when I visit or drive by these memorials for the warrior, the soldiers and their such. And even when you look at, when you're naming, places, like, I'm glad they changed Auburn just from Slaughterville, because Slaughter, we know of what type of man he was. But even when you drive by anything recognizing Stevens or even his son Stevens, that sort of thing, those are names on important peaks, that sort of thing. You get that like, ugh. But if you only knew, if people only knew what they were, celebrating. Yeah. So it's a negative. It's definitely a negative emotion versus visiting the tribal areas. And, even if there's no memorials, we go to places that we don't have archaeology and it's not an official memorial, but we know that as we're doing the archaeology, we're interacting with our ancestors physically, but there's also a spiritual presence when we're doing this work. And you could feel the presence of your ancestors sometimes, or most of the times. And, that creates that same reverence as if you're at a memorial. So it's an unofficial memorial, but it still has the same feelings when you're visiting those memorials for like Leshai.
My personal reaction as a Native American, the first thing that comes to mind, what typically happens is I say a prayer and honor that event, honor the warriors, honor our tribal representatives that were there and involved, honor the lives that were lost there, and also honor the people that survived it. There's, of course, prayers go out to the warriors and to the warriors that fell on the battlefield, and to the leaders that were the thinkers, the ones who established what position, what direction are we going to take against these settlers, against this government that wants our resources, not because they're hungry, not because they're shusha bob in our language, not because they're poor and pitiful. It's because they were greedy. They simply wanted this to benefit their bank accounts, not to feed their people. They wanted this land and these resources to sell. Whereas our battle was, we want to feed our people. We want to house our people. We want to take care of our people. That's where that fight comes from deep within. People use treaty rights and inherent rights, but the drive really comes from deep within the heart and soul, that my children need food, my grandparents need fish, my aunties and uncles need deer meat and elk meat, berries, etc. So when I see these monuments, these are acknowledgments of efforts, not just by the tribal effort, but also the settlers' effort, the government at that time, the government's efforts to separate and make that distinction between man and land, separating us, trying to prevent us from utilizing these resources and regulations. These trying to over-regulate, and all these feelings that when you see these monuments, like Brandon referenced, they oftentimes get it wrong, or at least the verbiage is one-sided. And so you get this perspective of this historical event, historical place, but you only get the non-native perspective, and oftentimes it's wrong. So you wish you could rewrite it, or at least revisit the project that created these monuments. And there's a completely different side, another side to this, a truthful side, and a Native American, a First Peoples side.
For me, monuments, I agree with Warren. They're one-sided, very one-sided. If they're going to keep them, they need to update them, because there is another side to that story. For tribal people, we didn't need a monument. Our landmarks and landscape was our monuments for everything we did, whether it was gathering for baskets, for food, traveling. So to us, this wasn't something that we did because we already knew how to get from one place to another, or what was at that site. So we go specific places to gather cedar, we go specific places to gather shellfish, to fish. So you didn't need the monument to say that what was happening there. But for tribal people, it's also, there were sacred sites. You didn't want a monument up there to tell people where you go. Some of the people went to seek their power or whatever. You didn't want people knowing where that was. There was no thought of putting monuments there. Same thing. Anything that happened, you see in a lot of these monuments, it's tragic. So many people were killed, and it's like, why do we want to see that? For tribal people, that site would have a different meaning. There was a reason we fought for it. There was a reason we were trying to protect it. There was a reason we were trying to keep it. With monuments, I've read them, but like I said, there's never enough background, and it does make you upset. And you really don't want your kids to read it. But if they're going to continue, it should be updated, like what Muckleshoot did, put the other side of the story, because there's always two sides to a story. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with the Leschi, with the marker being damaged and the information from the exoneration, to give that history of why Leschi was hung in the first place, but a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of times there's just not enough history, there's not enough background information at these monuments, but it needs to happen. There needs to be the other side of it.
So monuments are kind of lacking, and of course, they don't have a lot of space to add information either. How do people get the real history? That's important for us as we, worked through this whole piece about the Medicine Creek Treaty Wars and everything else, getting the missing history out there. And I think monuments have a lot of missing history still. There's another monument I've got mixed feelings about. There's a parking lot off of Steilacoom Boulevard where Leschi was hung. And so you put a monument there as a location, but it kind of, what do you think about that? Is that a celebration of here's the tree that Leschi was hung on, or do people get the rest of the history that goes along with that? And there is some good history that people can learn about that. And so where do they get that from, and how do you update that is the big question. the reason that was the location was because the officers and enlisted people at Fort Steilacoom objected to Leschai's conviction and were up in arms against that. And were actually under lockdown when they came and took Leschai out from where he was being held at Fort Steilacoom and went off site because they were fearing that they would have an uprising of the military folk as well. And we know today the rest of that story has been rectified, and people know that he was hung inappropriately for war crimes that probably weren't committed by him. But that's not a part of the monument, right? And it's not very visible either. So people have to stumble across that monument. Really, they really do have to just, oops, what's that I just tripped over? I'll say this, I'm personally against those roadside monuments that represent where somebody died alongside the road in an auto wreck of some collision or something. That's not the story of that person's life, nor is the hanging of Leschai the story of his life. It's a part of the story, and it's an important part. Having a monument somewhere else may be an opportunity to tell the rest of the story instead of, monumenting that place of death.
The monuments reflect the opinions during that era. It's a statement that provides us insight into how our European neighbors perceived not only the event, but what the event represents, what the battle represents, what it was about. And even though it gets it wrong, and even though it's extremely negative, one solution would be to erect a monument by the tribes that provides information and more background into why we as the tribal people of that era, why were they so adamant about this war and about this conflict, about what was at stake. And I think that's what needs to be presented. People will get a sense of what we as natives are dealing with when we see these monuments and how wrong they are and what they represent. I think that non-natives, if we were to summarize into 2 paragraphs what that battle meant to us, and still does to this day, I think we'd get a complete different reaction from our European neighbors if we were able to share a little bit of what was at stake. But it would also give non-natives a taste of what we as Native Americans, when we see these monuments and what they represent and how wrong they are, they'll get to say, oh my gosh, and they have to see that. I would hate to drive by that every single day. I really would. It'd be disturbing. We've bought into the idea that this post-treaty village that we now call Muckleshoot, where I live, I have to call that home. But it's better than the other alternative, which was to simply just disappear, get folded into the population, or maybe just move to the mountains and disappear. Mm-hmm. But right, the cup's half full and it's half empty. What was the purpose and what was the end result? Well, we're still here talking about it, and we're more open-minded about it in this era, in this chapter. So I'm grateful for that. But I would love to have another monument providing the voice of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to join us monthly as we continue the conversation among diverse communities impacted by the Treaty War and its aftermath. To learn more about the Puget Sound Treaty War, visit our tribal partner websites and fortnisqually.org, where you can watch our 4-part panel series on the conflict. This podcast is generously supported by the Tacoma Historic Preservation Office and the Tacoma Arts Commission. Music by by Vincent Johnson, Nooksack Lummi, and Nishani Johnson, Jamestown Sklallam Lummi.